more views since my son's in the school district.
Cool.
So we'll get some news on this. Hi, I'm Robin Miller, host of Miller Chat. My guest today is Brendan Mahan,
Yes.
ADHD coach and podcaster for his podcast, ADHD Essentials.
Yes, ma'am. Yes. ADHD Essentials. That's me.
Well, welcome. Thank you for coming on.
Thank you very much. Thank you for having me.
So, just tell the viewers a little bit about yourself.
So, my name is Brendan Mahan, and I'm an ADHD coach, consultant, and trainer. So I work with adults and families and kids affected by ADHD, helping them navigate the disorder, understand the disorder better, communicate more effectively, problem solve around the skills deficits that ADHD can bring with it. And I also I consult with schools and mental health agencies, and I provide trainings for primarily schools, but certainly the occasional mental health agency I might provide a training for as well, and even for parents, where I've been at the Shrewsbury Library and libraries in the area a decent amount.
Oh, good.
Just trying to get the word out there, helping people understand it. And then, like you said, I have the podcast ADHD Essentials, where I interview parents affected by ADHD, either because they have it or because their kids have it. I interview experts, and that might be an expert in the realm of ADHD. That might be an expert who is specialized in parenting. I had an expert on The Voice for one of my episodes where she talked about using the voice as a parenting tool.
Oh, I can see that.
Yeah, and I also interview educators so that parents can come to understand what a kid's day is like at school a little bit more, because they spend so much time there, and so many parents know nothing about what that looks like. So I'm trying to pull back the curtain a little bit.
And you did David Pelkey. You interviewed David Pelkey, right?
I did, yeah. I interviewed Dave Pilkey, the creator of Captain Underpants, about maybe a month ago. And that was cool because my sons got to be on that episode with me.
I think that's, for a lot of kids, that's a dream, to really interview an author that they really like.
Right, yeah. And he actually has ADHD and dyslexia.
I'm not surprised based on his book.
Right.
He says that in his book.
Yeah, his books are semi-autobiographical. And he created both Captain Underpants and Dogman, the two big ones right now, when he was in elementary school, because he was politely asked to step out of the classroom due to behavior. And when he was out of the room, he drew comics. And he talks about all of that on the episode.
Well, I think that's a nice way to spend your time being creative.
Yeah, absolutely.
A lot of the authors who do superheroes, that's how it started.
Yep, yeah.
So what led you to become an ADHD coach?
So I was a teacher for 7 years. And at the time, schools were a little strapped for money. And often in schools, the first one in, I'm sorry, I misspoke. Often in schools, the last one in is the first one out. So I would get hired, I'd be there for a year or two, then they wouldn't have enough money, and somebody would have to go somewhere else due to reorganizing or something, and that person became me. So I eventually decided to shift over to guidance counseling, because as a teacher, you can only get so good at the job without keeping a curriculum for more than a year or two. And I wasn't keeping a curriculum because I kept going from school district to school district. But what I got really good at was working with the kids. And all of the social emotional learning stuff that's big right now, that was sort of always my focus. I always believed that emotions beat academics every time.
Of course.
But when I was teaching, a lot of staff and a lot of administrators wanted academics to beat emotions. So, so I shifted over to guidance counseling because I knew emotions were more of a focus in guidance counseling.
Yes.
And so I have 2 degrees. I have a master's of education and I have a master's in school counseling.
Oh.
And there's all of 6 guidance counseling jobs that are open every year, and there's thousands of people who want them. There's typically between 60 and 100 applicants to every guidance counseling job. So they're not easy to get.
No, they're not.
And I wound up doing the ADHD stuff on the side for a while, concurrent with doing some special ed work, some mental health work, and waiting for that guidance counseling job. And eventually I just said, or I can just do this ADHD work.
Right.
So I'm just doing the ADHD work now.
Yeah. Well, it's good that you're in it and you're specialized in it. Can you tell us a little bit about ADHD?
Yeah, so ADHD is a developmental disorder. It's not a behavior disorder like so many people often think. That's one of the misconceptions about it. It's what happens is in your brain, you've got a part of our brain called the prefrontal cortex, or the frontal lobe. Sort of both of those things matter right now. And in the ADHD brain, that part, which is the area of the brain that's responsible for careful decision making, planning and prioritizing, time awareness, emotional regulation, just doing stuff, just the motivation to do something. In the ADHD brain, that area develops more slowly than a neurotypical brain. So they're developmentally delayed, folks with ADHD. And I'm going to say we because I have ADHD, so that's a piece of this, right? Part of why I get to work with folks with ADHD is because I get it. I've been living it for 41 years. So especially kids, there's this developmental delay where it's much more noticeable in a child than it is in an adult. Different sort of rules of thumb, 30% delay, a year to 3 year delay. The middle of the year to 3 is 2. It makes it a lot easier to understand. So if we're looking at a 2 year delay, that puts your 7th grade kid who's in the center of middle school in 5th grade, which is the end of elementary school. For us in Shrewsbury, it's the beginning of middle school. But that's a big difference. We don't expect the same stuff from a 7th grader that we do from a 5th grader. So a piece of ADHD is that it's this developmental delay. A lot of it comes down to executive functions, which are, again, that time management, planning and prioritizing, all those sorts of things. But those are also skills that can be taught. And that's a lot of what I do. I don't go deep with medication. I refer people to doctors for that. I am not a doctor. I instead build skills and help parents understand what the disorder is all about. And so a lot of those skills are executive functioning skills, most of which can be taught. But kids with ADHD, we need to teach things a little bit differently. And often we have to teach it again and again and again. And then when we finally are sick of teaching it, we have to teach it 3 or 4 more times, and then they'll get it.
Yeah, I mean, you're right about that. They know in the mental health that the DSM diagnostic standard manual is now a neurodevelopmental condition.
Right.
And they're knowing that more and more things may cause those things to happen, you know, anywhere from cigarette smoking to being born premature.
Right. Yeah, there's a number of correlations with ADHD. We don't know the cause, but premature birth, addiction in the family is correlated with ADHD,
definitely.
not necessarily because the addiction causes it, probably because the ADHD causes the addiction. And why that happens, or a piece of why that happens, is that another component for the ADHD brain is less dopamine. Dopamine is a chemical in the brain that makes you want to do something. It's motivation and reward, anticipation and reward. The ADHD brain doesn't create as much and doesn't utilize it efficiently. It's called poor uptake, but we don't need to get that technical. And so it's a lot like the ADHD person is driving a Hummer and the gas tank is only about halfway full, whereas your neurotypical person, someone who doesn't have ADHD, they're driving a Prius.
Right.
And we're expected to go to the same place. One of ththose is more prepared and able to get there efficiently.
Yeah, well, it's good that they know that now, because back in the day, they used to call it like, I remember it was like a brain dysfunction.
Right.
I remember doing a paper on it in grad school, So what are your credentials to become an ADHD coach?
My background as an educator, those 2 master's degrees. And also I worked as a mental health clinician for a little while. I worked for a little while also as a special education teacher. As a substitute, but still I did the job. I wrote the IEPs. I've written 504s because I have the guidance counseling background. And having it is a credential. It's not an official credential, but it's there. It really helps me understand my clients in a way that people who don't have ADHD can't. And then it boils down to just doing the job. Like I've been working with so many people around ADHD that I know how to do it. And then I work with kids, I work with adults. There are coaching programs that people can go to. That's absolutely a thing. I have not had the chance to do that yet. And the reason for that is usually either I haven't had enough time to do it or I haven't had enough money to do it, because it's like going to grad school. Like there's money there, only you can't get a loan for it. So it's something I'll get to eventually, but I've been doing this job for going on 7 or 8 years now, and I am a recognized expert in the field. I'll be presenting at the International Conference on ADHD in November. If I didn't know what I was doing, I wouldn't be presenting there. So that happens too.
Yeah, I mean, I find I do it on the college level, small, as like a sex coach. I've taken some webinar classes in it, but being a person of lived experience, and my son has it, and I used to work at an independent living agency and do skills, independent living skills. Like I said, we live it, we know it, and we're good at it. Suppose somebody, that's another option. You can go to that program. But unless you have lived experience or you have your name out and experience behind you. Oh, excuse me. So it really all depends on your experience and where you're going.
Absolutely. And a lot of my educational background, it's not just about understanding kids and their challenges at school. It's also understanding how to teach and how to communicate.
Right.
Teaching is really communication. So those skills I found have really benefited me in my work with people who have ADHD, because often I'm helping them build skills. I'm helping them initially in the early stages learn what ADHD is and how it works.
Right.
And that's all communication and teaching.
Yeah. If you can relate and engage.
Right.
Knowledge, credentials is nice to have. It looks nice, but you have to have, again, the experience, the rapport building.
Right.
You have to know how to engage.
Absolutely. And that's my counseling degree.
Yeah. You have to know how to engage and how to keep the person interested.
Yes.
Because really, that's what it's all about, interpersonal skills.
It is. I agree with you.
And besides having some good executive functioning skills to role model to students. Right.
Yeah. And a lot of what happened with me is I became the person I needed. Right. Like in school, I wasn't diagnosed with ADHD until I was in my late 30s. So I didn't get taught those skills directly that I needed, and I barely made it out of undergrad. My first master's degree was a little bit of a challenge, but not too terrible, because by then I was learning the things I wanted to learn. And with ADHD, if it's the stuff you like, it's easier to do and you're more engaged. But if it's something that you're doing because you have to, that can be more challenging for us. And once you hit master's degree, typically you're learning mostly stuff you want to learn about.
You have to be disciplined.
Right.
Because I could tell you, having 2 master's degrees, the work is hard.
It is.
And you basically either you know it or you don't, or you're committed to knowing it.
Right.
Because it's going to lead you hopefully to a job.
Yeah.
So who do you typically work with?
So I work with typically people in transition, and that can mean a number of different things. It might mean a kid going from elementary school to middle school, or middle school to high school, and those years where the executive functioning requirements of middle school versus elementary school, high school versus middle school, there's some big leaps that happen, and kids can struggle. And the same is true going into college. I have clients who are in college as well, and even grad school. And so those transitions educationally are folks that I'll work with. I also work with parents and families whose kids are diagnosed with ADHD, either recently and they're trying to figure out what that means, so I come in, or they've had that diagnosis for a little while now, but now the kid's struggling for whatever reason. And there's a number of different reasons. Generally speaking, folks with ADHD struggle with transition. And that might mean going from one class to another. That might mean moving. That might mean parents getting a divorce, or an adult getting a new job or becoming unemployed, or a family that has a kid now. Like that, I know for me, I was doing okay, and then we had kids. We had identical twins. And I fell apart a little bit when that happened, because that's a huge transition, both in terms of how much sleep you're getting, in terms of where your time needs to go and how your priorities shift. So that was a time of struggle for me. And that was what caused me to look at the fact that maybe I have ADHD. Maybe I should do something about this. I knew it. I've known it since undergrad when I was a psych major. And I was like, hey, that looks familiar. But in undergrad, when you're a psych major, they're like, you're going to think you have all of these things.
Right,
you're going to think you're bipolar and depressed and have ADHD and everything. The only one that happened for me was ADHD. I was like, that one. But I figured I was just jumping to conclusions like they say. No. Because then I went into teaching and I was like, that ADHD thing, that still seems like a thing. They send checklists for teachers to do for their students to see if the kids get ADHD.
The Vanderbilt.
Yeah, the Vanderbilt. Connors happens sometimes too. And I would fill them out for the kid and for me. Like in my head, I'd be like that one. And I'd be like, I'm worse than this kid. And he's going to get an IEP or a 504. So, or I'm better than this kid. Sometimes it wasn't as bad.
Right.
And so that was always fun, but I finally had to look at it for real. And I'm glad that I did.
Yeah, I mean, back in the day in the 70s, for girls, if I went to school, girls didn't have it. Oh, no, they didn't have it. They had like an anxiety disorder.
Right.
And then back again, like we mentioned, brain dysfunction until the 80s and 90s, things started to shift. There was a shift in way of thinking.
Right.
Framework. It was a paradigm shift.
Absolutely. And interestingly, if for most people, you mentioned the DSM, for most folks, if you took the description of anxiety and the description of ADHD and just took the labels off of them from the DSM and gave them to your typical man or woman on the street, 50-50 chance they're going to know which one's which because they're so similar. They're described so closely.
Yeah.
And the ADHD one, there's a lot more to ADHD than we see in the DSM. It doesn't even begin to start talking about how people with ADHD experience time differently than people who are neurotypical. But those correlations, those similarities between ADHD and anxiety are really prominent.
Right.
And they go hand in hand. If you've got ADHD, you've tangled with anxiety at some point in your life if you're not dealing with it constantly.
Yeah, you have to manage it.
Right.
Because I tell people, who you meet along the way that it's a lifelong. It's a genetic component that happened to be activated by an event or something.
Yeah.
And that it's lifelong, and it's like diabetes, and you have to manage it. Whether you need medication or not, that's a private decision.
Right.
But there's other ways to manage it, but you have to be conscious of it as opposed to denying it.
Absolutely. And some of the research coming out is saying, no, it looks like people might grow out of ADHD, but not everybody. Some people do, some people don't. And I'm always skeptical about that because of the transition stuff I talked about earlier.
Right.
ADHD can become balanced, right? You can kind of figure out your strategies for compensating for it. But if you have a life change, your ADHD that you think has been cured might suddenly flare up, and now you're struggling, and if you don't go back to that ADHD stuff, you're going to continue to struggle.
Right.
And particularly if you are under the impression that you haven't had ADHD since you were a kid, right? And then you get a new job that's significantly more demanding, or you have kids, or you get divorced, or something like that, you're not only dealing with the challenge of typical experience like that, the challenge of a harder job, the challenge of a divorce, the challenge of having kids, you're also dealing with these executive functions that are suddenly being taxed more than they ordinarily are.
Absolutely.
And what do we do with that?
Yeah, that's true. So what are some of the challenges do you see? I mean, do you see a lot of people deny it? Kids, families?
I think if you're denying ADHD, you don't call me. So the typical time that I find people denying ADHD, it's in my workshops. And so I had a guy who was like, isn't that just being lazy? And I'm like, no, it's not. I don't believe in lazy. I don't think lazy is a thing. My definition for lazy is learned helplessness born out of a lack of skills. So I don't know how to do this thing.
Right.
And so I decide I'm helpless and I can't. When that's not true, you just haven't learned the skills yet.
Right.
I can't speak French, but that doesn't mean I could never ever be able to speak French. I could certainly learn that.
It's a discipline.
But I have to put the time in, I have to put the effort in. I don't happen to need to learn French. So I'm probably not going to learn French, but I could if I needed to. It would be a little harder for me with the ADHD. I'd have to put in more effort and more time.
Right.
But I could do it. So I get lazy sometimes. There's people who are like, isn't that just normal? Isn't that everybody? Because there's times when I don't feel like doing stuff. There's times when I lose track of time or I go to get places late. And my answer to that is, yes, that sort of is everybody. But we don't say that that person isn't depressed because I get sad too sometimes. It's different. Like, it's diagnosable. It's interfering in your life in a way that is detrimental. And I often refer to ADHD as life on hard mode because so much of what ADHD brings with it just makes everything harder. And if you can manage the emotional side of that, you're probably going to be okay. If you can learn the skills you need, even though it's harder to learn them or harder to bring them to bear, you're probably going to be okay. But if you don't get pointed in the right direction, it's life on hard mode, and you may or may not be successful. Because organization, time management, emotional regulation, those are the building blocks of success, right? That's how you get to success, and those things are harder for people with ADHD. So we have to work harder.
Yeah, I know. I've worked with a few students with ADHD in college. It's a transition, doing it one way and then doing another. It's a discipline. But of course, when you have external factors like video games and asking how much time they spend on it, or whatever else, you definitely have to really, you have to discipline yourself. You got to put the reins on.
And I tend to be a little careful with the word discipline, right? Because depending on how we decide to look at it, depending on the approach we're taking, you can say, well, just be more disciplined. How?
You have to show them how.
How do we do that? What does that mean? Because just try harder isn't going to help somebody with ADHD. Because someone with ADHD, it's life on hard mode. I'm already trying really hard. I'm trying as hard as I can, and I'm getting a C+, B-. This person isn't trying at all, and they're getting an A-.
I've seen that too.
What do you mean I have to try harder? What do you mean I have to be more disciplined? I think I am disciplined. So we need to teach the skills and teach different approaches and better ways to do whatever it is that we need to do. How do we be more disciplined with our phone? What does that look like? A real basic skill, or I'm sorry, a real basic activity or challenge I give to my clients is I say to them, take your phone, next time you go to the supermarket, leave it in your car.
Yep, absolutely.
But that's not the end. When you go to the supermarket, just notice how many times you feel the pull of your phone. And now we're starting to get an idea of where that addiction to the phone is. And that goes for anybody, ADHD or no ADHD. One of the tricky pieces for ADHD is the phone is a miracle for us. My phone is my executive functions in a lot of ways.
Yes.
My Google Calendar, everything I do is in my Google Calendar, especially professionally. Sometimes my personal life can lose track of it a little bit, but professionally it's all in there. And it sends me alerts. It lets me know when I need to be to the television studio to talk to Robin Miller. It lets me know when I have a client coming. It lets me know when I blocked off this time to edit my podcast because otherwise you're not going to do it because you've been forgetting recently. And so that reminder is really important. And having that calendar with me in my pocket, in my phone, all the time is useful because I can usually get through anywhere between a day, maybe a day and a half, knowing what's going on and when I have things to do and that kind of stuff. But if I'm looking out a week from now, 2 weeks from now, I have no idea. And if I had an appointment, like I took my kids to the dentist yesterday, I made appointments for 2 months from now. But those went in my calendar. I took my phone right out and plugged those in. Because if I wrote that down on a piece of paper or I got a little business card with that appointment on the back of it, I'm going to lose that piece of paper. I'm going to forget when that appointment is, and I may or may not make it. But if I put it in my calendar, I'm all set. Because that 2-month distance is really hard, especially for folks with ADHD.
Yeah, and you have to, the discipline has to be basically like your own way of which your discipline is individual to you.
Right. You gotta, and you have to stick with those strategies. That's where the discipline is. Find the strategies and then stick with them, which also is hard for folks with ADHD. With my clients, typically things work in one of two ways. They work with me and they think I'm a miracle worker, and I am not a miracle worker. I just give strategies. 10% better is all I'm looking for. But let's build that 10% over time so that a year from now, your worst day is better than your best day now, right? But one reason that we see a lot of growth early on sometimes is because all of these strategies are new, they're interesting, they see how they might work, and they immediately start to apply them. But after a week or two, they're not new and interesting anymore.
Yeah.
They're boring. So my clients stop using them. And then they come to me and they're like, yeah, it just doesn't work. I'm like, is it not working or are you not doing it? Because those are two different things.
Right.
And so that's a little bit of where the discipline comes in. But sometimes we have to break down that strategy even more and say, all right, if you're not doing it, how are we going to help you remember to do it?
Right.
Are we going to use sticky notes on the door as you leave the house to remind you to get the gas or whatever? Are we going to use an Alexa and have a verbal out loud reminder? Alexas are great for folks with ADHD. Are we going to send emails to ourselves or have our client or a coach or a wife or somebody send us emails so that we remember and have a list of to do? What's the plan and how are we going to make sure we follow through with it?
Well, we have like less than 3 minutes, so just to move along, why don't we talk about the Wall of Awful model that you're doing?
So yeah, the Wall of Awful, I'll be presenting on this at the International Conference on ADHD. It's my model for the emotional barrier that gets erected when we struggle and fail. So every time we fail, we get a little failure brick in our wall. Along with the failure brick, we get a disappointment brick because we disappointed ourselves. And a disappointment brick for anyone whose opinion matters in that failure. So mom, dad, a teacher, a husband, a wife, a boss, that kind of stuff. More and more bricks come. In order to engage in that task that we frequently fail at, we have to get past this wall. There's 5 ways people typically try to get past it. Only 2 of them work. 3 work, 1 is unhealthy, 2 are healthy, and 2 don't work. Sometimes people stare at it. You don't get anywhere. Some people try to go around it, but it's a metaphor and it's infinitely wide, I know, because I made it up. You're not going around the wall. So those don't work. Some people Hulk smash their way through. This is the kid that's like, fine, I'll do my math, rah, and they get all mad at you. They're getting up enough anger and frustration to push through this emotional barrier. Anger is a strong emotion. Or they might be like, I suck, what's wrong with me? They're just Hulk smashing inward. That works, but it's damaging. And by the way, that's fight, flight, and freeze. Those are those 3. And then you can climb it, which is sitting with those emotions, navigating them, often without even realizing it. This is the kid who takes their binders out for 20 minutes, right? They're not taking binders out. It doesn't take that long. They're climbing the wall of awful. They're getting themselves emotionally ready to do this assignment they don't want to do. Or you can put a door in it. And a door is like your friend who keeps trying to go to the gym and they just don't go. But now they listen to Metallica or the Eye of the Tiger, and that gets them out the door because music changes our emotional state. And that's putting a door in it. So that, in a very small nutshell, is the Wall of Awful and how it works.
Well, we have less than a minute to go, so why don't you just say your website, how people can contact you?
Sure. My name again is Brendan Mahan. My website is ADHDessentials.com. You can email me at brendan@ADHDessentials.com. That's ADHDessentials.com. And I have a podcast on iTunes and podcast servers called ADHD Essentials.
Well, thank you, Brendan, for coming on and talking about your work as an ADHD coach and a podcaster.
Thank you for having me.
You're welcome. So this has been another episode of Miller Chat. My name is Robin Miller, and have a good fall. See you next time.